The massive chamber stretched out like a metal cave filled with strange lights and weird smells. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the center of it all and tried not to show how impressed he was by the alien technology around him. The walls seemed to breathe and pulse with their own life, while hundreds of different creatures sat in floating chairs that moved without any visible power source. Some of the aliens looked like giant insects with too many eyes, while others appeared to be made of living crystal that sparkled when they moved. A few resembled walking trees, with bark that shifted colors, and others looked like floating jellyfish that spoke through musical sounds instead of words. Dr. Lisa Park stood next to Morrison and held her tablet tight in her hands. She had been documenting everything since they arrived at the Galactic Council 3 hours ago, but she still could not believe what she was seeing. 3 years had passed since first contact with alien life, and humanity was still trying to understand their place in this vast community of space-traveling species. The humans had been given something called probationary status, which meant they could talk to the aliens but could not vote on important decisions or join any of the big projects that shaped how the galaxy worked. Morrison had grown tired of being treated like children who needed supervision. Earth had sent him here with clear instructions to demand full membership in the Galactic Confederation, or humanity would withdraw from all diplomatic relations and go their own way among the stars. The alien leaders did not seem to understand that humans were serious about this ultimatum, and Morrison was beginning to think they saw his species as nothing more than interesting pets who had learned to use spaceships. Ambassador Sexthai of the Vorthan Empire rose from his floating chair, and his crystal body caught the light from dozens of different sources. When he spoke, his voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, but the words that came out were anything but peaceful. He announced that the humans had made unreasonable demands for full membership, and that their aggressive nature made them unsuitable for true galactic citizenship. Sexthai went on to explain that humans had only been traveling in space for a few hundred years, while most of the species in the Council had been exploring the stars for thousands or even millions of years. Morrison felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression calm. The aliens seemed to think that age automatically meant wisdom, and that newer species should be grateful for any attention from their betters. What they did not understand was that humans had earned their place in space through hard work and determination, rather than just waiting around for someone else to solve their problems for them. Earth had faced extinction events that would have destroyed other worlds, and humanity had found ways to survive and grow stronger from each challenge. Council Elder Morden of the Ethereal Collective raised one of his translucent arms and spoke in a voice that sounded like whispers echoing in an empty room. He agreed with Sexthai that humans lacked the evolutionary refinement necessary for full membership, and pointed out that their aggression levels were far above what the Council considered acceptable for civilized species. Morden explained that humans still engaged in warfare among themselves and had not achieved the peaceful unity that marked truly advanced civilizations. Dr. Park leaned toward Morrison and whispered that maybe they should consider accepting a longer probationary period instead of pushing for immediate full membership. She pointed out that some of the other species had waited centuries before being granted full voting rights, and that humanity might benefit from more time to learn galactic customs and procedures. Morrison listened to her concerns, but he knew that going back to Earth empty-handed was not an option. The people of Earth had already waited 3 years for this moment, and they deserved to be treated as equals rather than students in some cosmic classroom. High Arbiter Velnara suddenly stood up from her throne-like chair, and all 4 of her arms began moving in complex patterns that Morrison recognized as some kind of ritual gesture. Her species looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a spider, but her voice carried the authority of someone who had been making important decisions for a very long time. She announced that the Council had prepared a solution to the human problem that would either prove their worthiness for full membership or demonstrate once and for all that they were not ready for such responsibility. Morrison stepped forward and crossed his arms over his chest in a gesture that every human would recognize as defiance mixed with curiosity. He told Velnara that humanity was listening and ready to hear whatever test or challenge the Council had prepared for them. Dr. Park tried to catch his attention and shake her head in warning, but Morrison had already made up his mind that backing down was not an option. Velnara smiled with too many teeth and explained that the Council wanted to offer humanity the chance to face something called the Crucible of Kethmora. She described it as a test of survival and mental strength that had never been completed by any species in galactic history. The challenge would prove whether humans truly possessed the qualities necessary for full membership or whether they were simply another violent young species that needed more time to mature before joining galactic society. The chamber fell, silent as hundreds of alien eyes focused on Morrison and waited for his response. Dr. Park grabbed his arm and whispered urgently that they needed to know more about this test before agreeing to anything. She pointed out that accepting an unknown challenge without understanding the risks could end up destroying humanity's chances for membership entirely. Morrison understood her concerns, but he also knew that showing fear or hesitation would only confirm what the aliens already believed about human weakness. Morrison looked directly at Velnara and told her that humanity accepted the challenge without conditions or delays. The chamber erupted in shocked sounds as different species expressed their surprise through clicks and whistles and musical notes that hurt human ears. Many of the aliens had clearly expected Morrison to ask for time to consider the offer, or to try negotiating for easier terms. Instead, he had agreed immediately to face a test that had apparently never been passed by anyone. Velnara struggled to hide her own surprise and explained that the crucible of Kethamora had driven 3 entire species to extinction and caused 2 others to retreat from galactic society entirely. No being had ever survived the complete testing protocol, and most participants suffered permanent psychological damage even when they were rescued before the trial killed them. She wanted to make sure that Morrison understood the stakes involved and that failure would mean humanity would be banned from requesting membership again for 50 standard years. Morrison smiled the kind of confident smile that had gotten him through military training and space exploration and diplomatic missions that should have killed him years ago. He told Velnara that she clearly did not understand humans very well if she thought this challenge would break them. The aliens had no idea what humanity had already survived just to reach this point in their development, and Morrison was looking forward to showing them exactly what Earthborn determination could accomplish when properly motivated. 3 weeks later, the human transport ship docked with Station Kethamora, and Jake Morrison got his first look at the place where his species would either prove themselves worthy of galactic citizenship or face 50 years of isolation from the greater community of stars. The station itself looked like something that had grown rather than been built, with organic curves and flowing lines that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. Strange lights moved through translucent tubes that ran along the walls like blood vessels in some massive living creature, and Morrison could feel a low vibration through the deck plates that reminded him of being inside a whale. Dr. Lisa Park checked her instruments and frowned at the readings she was getting from the station's atmosphere. The air was breathable for humans, but it contained trace elements that would make most Earth plants sick, and the gravity was slightly heavier than what they were used to on their homeworld. She made notes about how these small differences might affect the team's performance during whatever challenges they were about to face, and wondered if the aliens had designed these conditions specifically to put human physiology at a disadvantage. Morrison had brought a team of 12 people with him, and each one had been chosen for different skills that might prove useful during the trial. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had served in every major conflict of the past 10 years and knew more about survival in hostile environments than anyone else in the human military. Engineer Ben Carter had solved impossible problems on Mars colonies and asteroid mining stations, where failure meant death for everyone involved. Mountain climber Alex Chen had conquered peaks that had killed dozens of other climbers in deep sea. Researcher Nicole Foster had worked in pressure suits at depths that would crush most submarines. The team also included Marine Corporal Danny Walker, who had completed every survival course the military offered and seemed to think that facing death was just another day at the office. Medic Tom Brady had kept people alive in conditions that should have killed them, and pilot Sarah Johnson could fly anything with wings or rockets through weather that would ground commercial aircraft. Geologist Kevin Smith knew how to find water and shelter in places where both seemed impossible, and communications specialist Amy Davis could maintain contact with base even when all the equipment was broken and half the team was unconscious. Morrison had rounded out the team with psychologist Dr. Robert Wilson, who understood how stress affected human decision-making, and linguist Helen Martinez, who could communicate with alien species even when translation software failed. The final member was survival expert Jack Thompson, who had lived through disasters that had made him famous back on Earth for refusing to die when any reasonable person would have given up and accepted their fate. Overseer Clicktar met the human team at the docking port, and Morrison tried not to stare at the alien's insect-like appearance. Clicktar stood about 7 feet tall on 6 legs that ended in sharp claws, and his compound eyes seemed to look in every direction at once, while he spoke through a mouth that had too many moving parts. He welcomed the humans to what he called their doom and explained that they would have exactly 1 rotation period to familiarize themselves with the basic parameters of the test before the real challenge began. Clicktar led the team through corridors that seemed to shift and change when nobody was looking directly at them, and Morrison wondered if this was some kind of psychological warfare designed to make visitors feel disoriented and confused. The walls appeared to be made of some kind of living metal that responded to touch, and the ceiling was covered with patterns that hurt to look at for more than a few seconds. Strange smells filled the air and sounds echoed from directions that seemed impossible. Given the layout of the station, the first chamber they entered was designed to test temperature tolerance, and Clicktar explained with obvious satisfaction that it could simulate conditions ranging from the heat of molten worlds to the cold of deep space. Previous species had required months of preparation just to enter this room, and most participants needed specialized equipment that cost more than most planetary governments could afford. The Zenari monks had trained for 7 years before their attempt, and they had lasted exactly 4 hours before the temperature variations drove them to madness. Rodriguez walked over to one of the control panels and studied the readouts with professional interest. She asked Clicktar if this was really supposed to be the difficult part of the test because the temperature range was actually less extreme than what human soldiers experienced during winter training exercises in Alaska or summer operations in desert environments. She pointed out that humans regularly worked in conditions that would kill most alien species, and they did it without any special preparation beyond basic equipment and common sense. The second chamber contained gravity manipulation, systems that could create crushing forces or leave beings floating helplessly in zero gravity while trying to complete complex tasks. Clicktar explained that the gravity wells could reach levels that would break bones, and that the sudden changes in gravitational orientation had driven several species to complete psychological breakdown. The chamber walls were covered with obstacles that required precise movement and coordination while dealing with forces that changed without warning. Carter examined the engineering systems and shook his head in amazement at how unnecessarily complicated the aliens had made everything. He told the group that this was basically just like working on a space station during an emergency, when the gravity generators were malfunctioning and everyone had to keep doing their jobs while floating around and getting thrown against bulkheads. Most human engineers dealt with situations like this at least once a month, and they considered it annoying rather than terrifying. The third chamber was designed for psychological warfare and contained projection systems that could create realistic images of a being's worst fears and most traumatic memories. Clicktar seemed especially pleased with this part of the test and explained that the neural stress inducers could drive participants to madness within minutes by forcing them to relive their most painful experiences over and over again. No species had ever lasted more than 6 hours in this chamber, and most begged to be removed within the first 30 minutes. Dr. Wilson walked around the psychological testing equipment and started laughing when he realized what it was designed to do. He explained to Clicktar that this was basically just exposure therapy combined with stress inoculation, which were standard treatments that human psychologists use to help people overcome trauma and phobias. Most human military personnel went through similar training as part of their preparation for combat, and they learned to function effectively even when facing their worst fears. Walker examined the physical torture devices that were designed to test pain tolerance and endurance and compared them to the survival training he had completed during his military service. He told Morrison that this looked like the SEER course they had done in Alaska, except someone had turned down the difficulty level and removed most of the really unpleasant parts. The aliens had apparently never heard of human military training, or they would have realized that their ultimate test was actually easier than what Earth soldiers went through every year just to stay qualified for duty. Chen studied the climbing walls that were embedded with razor-sharp crystals, and noted that they looked like devils. Tower, except someone had made them easier by adding obvious handholds and safety features. Foster examined the pressure chambers and pointed out that they were less dangerous than the deep ocean environments where she worked on a regular basis. The aliens seemed to have designed their test based on what would challenge species that had never faced real adversity, rather than beings who had evolved on a world that spent millions of years trying to kill them in creative ways. Morrison gathered his team for a final briefing before the test began and reminded them that the aliens thought this challenge was impossible. He explained that what the Galactic Council did not understand was that Earth had already tried to kill humanity every single day for hundreds of thousands of years, and Earth had been much more creative and persistent than anything these aliens could imagine. The team was about to show the galaxy exactly what it meant to be human, and Morrison was confident that they would surprise everyone with just how routine this impossible test would turn out to be for people who had grown up on the most dangerous planet in known space. The observation deck, filled with representatives from 47 different species in the air, buzzed with excited chatter in dozens of languages as alien dignitaries placed bets on how quickly the humans would break under the pressure of the crucible of Kethmora. Elder Morden adjusted his translucent form in his floating chair and predicted that the humans would last no more than 2 hours before begging to be rescued from the trial. Ambassador Zexthai wagered that their aggressive nature would turn them against each other within the first hour, when the stress became too much for their primitive minds to handle. Arbiter Velnara called for silence as the trial was about to begin and explained to the assembled observers that they were about to witness either the first successful completion of the crucible or the spectacular failure of another species that had overestimated their own capabilities. She reminded everyone that no being had ever survived the complete testing protocol, and that 3 entire species had been driven to extinction by attempting challenges that were beyond their evolutionary capacity to endure. Down in the first chamber, Jake Morrison gathered his team in a circle and reminded them that they were representing all of humanity in this moment. The 12 humans looked relaxed and confident, despite being surrounded by alien technology designed to break their minds and bodies through systematic torture. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez checked her equipment one final time while Engineer Ben Carter examined the chamber walls with professional curiosity rather than fear. Overseer Klicktar announced that the trial would begin with the Chamber of Infinite Descent, which combined crushing gravity with sonic frequencies specifically calibrated to cause panic and disorientation in most known species. The gravity would increase gradually until it reached levels that could break bones, while sounds designed to trigger primal terror filled the air around the test subjects. Previous participants had been driven to madness within minutes as their minds collapsed under the dual assault of physical and psychological pressure. The humans entered the chamber without ceremony or special preparation, and Morrison gave a simple hand signal that his team recognized from countless training exercises. As the gravity began to increase and the disorienting sounds started, Rodriguez began singing an old military marching song that every soldier in human space knew by heart. The other team members joined in immediately, and their voices grew louder as the challenges intensified rather than weakening under the strain. Up in the observation deck, shocked silence replaced the excited chatter as alien representatives struggled to understand what they were witnessing. The sonic frequencies that had driven other species to screaming madness were being overpowered by human voices raised in harmony and defiance. The gravity that had crushed the bones of previous challengers was being met with coordinated movement and mutual support as the humans helped each other maintain their footing and continue their advance through the chamber. Morden stared at his instruments and demanded that his technicians check the equipment because the readings had to be wrong. The gravity levels were definitely at crushing intensity, and the sonic bombardment was operating at maximum effectiveness, but somehow the humans were not only surviving, but actually seemed to be enjoying themselves. Their heart rates were elevated but remained within normal parameters for beings under physical stress, and their brain activity showed focus and determination rather than the panic and despair that had characterized every previous attempt. Rodriguez finished the first song and immediately started another one that got the whole team moving in rhythm with the increasing gravitational forces. The humans had adapted their movements to work with the changing conditions rather than fighting against them, and they maintained formation and morale through shared music and coordinated effort. What was supposed to be an ordeal of isolated suffering had become a group exercise in teamwork and endurance not collector activated. The second phase of testing with obvious desperation and announced that the chamber would now be filled with toxic gases while temperatures swung between freezing and blazing heat. The caustic atmosphere had burned the respiratory systems of previous species, while the thermal extremes caused cellular damage that led to organ failure and death. No participant had ever survived more than 30 minutes of this combination, and most died within the first 10 minutes. Lisa Park pulled what appeared to be standard human safety equipment from her pack and calmly distributed breathing apparatus to each team member. She announced that the atmospheric readings were similar to what they had encountered during the Venus terraforming project, except someone had forgotten to add the sulfuric acid rain. That made that job really challenging. The temperature swings were comparable to what humans experienced during Arctic survival training or desert operations and well within their operational parameters. Carter checked his instruments and reported that the toxic gases were actually less dangerous than what miners dealt with on asteroid extraction operations, and that the thermal variations were easier to handle than what engineers faced when working on fusion reactors or ice planet installations. The humans moved through the chamber with calm efficiency, while the aliens watched in growing amazement as their ultimate test was being treated like routine occupational safety procedures. Foster commented that the environment was actually quite pleasant compared to the deep ocean pressure suits she wore for her regular job, and noted that at least here there was no crushing water pressure or risk of explosive decompression if something went wrong. The team continued their coordinated advance through challenges that had killed entire expeditions from other species while maintaining casual conversation about how the current conditions compared to various dangerous jobs they had held back on Earth. Clicktar activated the third phase with shaking hands and announced that the chamber would now begin psychological warfare designed to project each participant's deepest fears and most traumatic memories. The holographic horrors would force them to relive their worst experiences, while their minds were already weakened by physical stress and environmental damage. The combination had broken every previous challenger and driven several to permanent madness. Even after they were rescued from the trial, the chamber filled with personalized projections tailored to destroy each individual's psychological defenses, and the aliens waited for the inevitable collapse as the humans faced their worst nightmares made manifest. Instead of screams of terror, the observation deck heard something even more shocking than the singing had been. The humans were laughing. Carter faced a holographic recreation of his worst engineering disaster and started explaining to his teammates how the real version had taught him valuable lessons about redundant safety systems and crisis management. He pointed out that the projection was not even in his top 10 worst days and began describing the time a Mars reactor went critical during a solar storm while he was the only engineer on duty for 3 days straight. Walker was actually having a conversation with his projected trauma and thanking it for the important life lessons it had provided. He explained to the hologram that facing his worst fears had made him stronger and more capable, and that he appreciated the experience even though it had been difficult at the time. The psychological warfare system seemed confused by this response and kept trying different approaches to break his mental defenses. Chen was critiquing the technical accuracy of his fear projection and pointing out flaws in how the avalanche physics had been rendered by the alien technology. He explained that real snow did not move like that and offered suggestions for how the simulation could be improved to provide a more realistic training experience. The other team members gathered around to watch him give a detailed analysis of where the holographic disaster had gotten the science wrong. Dr. Wilson was treating the entire psychological warfare phase like a fascinating research opportunity and taking notes on how the alien technology attempted to manipulate human mental processes. He explained to his colleagues that this was basically just exposure therapy combined with stress testing, which were standard treatments that human psychologists use to help people overcome trauma and build mental resilience. By the time the fifth phase began, the alien observers were in complete confusion, and several species were demanding that the test be stopped because Clearly, something had gone wrong with the equipment. The challenges that had destroyed civilizations were being treated like minor inconveniences by beings who seemed to find the whole experience mildly entertaining rather than terrifying. The humans were not just surviving the impossible, they were making it look easy, while maintaining team cohesion and positive morale that defied everything the aliens thought they knew about survival psychology. Elder Morden stared at his monitoring equipment and whispered that what they were witnessing could not be happening according to any known laws of biology or psychology. The thermal crucible should have killed the humans hours ago, when their cellular structure collapsed under the extreme temperature variations that had liquefied the internal organs of previous species. The toxic atmosphere should have burned through their respiratory systems, and the crushing gravity should have pulverized their bones into powder, yet somehow these impossible creatures were treating the deadliest challenges in galactic history like minor workplace hazards. Ambassador Zexthai demanded that his technicians run complete diagnostic checks on all testing equipment because the instruments had to be malfunctioning to show that the humans were not only surviving, but actually thriving under conditions that had destroyed entire civilizations. The crystal being's normally harmonious voice cracked with stress as he realized that everything his species believed about survival and endurance was being proven wrong by 12 individuals from a planet that most galactic citizens considered primitive and backwards. Down in the testing chambers, Jake Morrison coordinated his team's advance through the maze of eternal darkness while Overseer Clicktar watched in growing horror as the humans navigated impossible obstacles with casual efficiency. The maze had been designed to drive beings insane through sensory deprivation and spatial disorientation, but the humans were treating it like a routine training exercise that they had completed hundreds of times before. On their homeworld, Clicktar activated the 7th phase with desperate determination and announced that subjects would be placed in absolute darkness with no light or sound or reference points to guide their movement. The sensory deprivation had driven entire species to madness within hours, as their minds collapsed without external stimuli to maintain psychological stability. The maze itself contained deadly traps and impossible navigation challenges that had killed participants, even when they maintained their sanity through the ordeal. Rodriguez took point and began calling out terrain features and obstacles to her teammates, while Carter used engineering principles to map air currents and structural details that revealed the maze's layout. Dr. Lisa Park monitored everyone's vital signs and reported that stress levels remained well within normal parameters for humans engaged in routine survival operations. Alex Chen started mapping their route using techniques he had learned during cave exploration expeditions that took him into underground systems far more complex and dangerous than anything the aliens had constructed. The observation deck filled with confused chatter in dozens of languages as alien scientists tried to understand how the humans were communicating so effectively in total darkness and silence. Their coordination and teamwork actually seemed to improve under conditions that had broken every previous species, and their progress through the maze was faster and more efficient than participants who had been given light and sound to guide their movement. Dr. Park's voice carried clearly through the chamber as she explained that sound traveled really well in the current environment and that the team had spent 3 years training in much worse conditions during their preparation for deep space exploration. She reminded her colleagues about the lunar cave systems where they had practiced navigation in vacuum suits with no atmosphere to carry sound and no external light sources beyond what they brought with them. Foster commented that the maze was actually easier than the underwater cave systems she explored during her deep ocean research, because at least here they could breathe without specialized equipment and there was no risk of getting lost in currents that could carry them miles from their entry point. The environmental conditions were pleasant compared to working in pressure suits at depths where the water pressure could crush submarines, and the darkness was absolute beyond the range of artificial lights. Walker pointed out that the navigation challenges were simpler than land navigation exercises he had completed during military training, where teams had to find their way across hostile terrain while avoiding enemy patrols and maintaining radio silence for days at a time. The aliens had built their maze with logical layouts and consistent construction principles that made it relatively easy for humans trained in survival skills to understand and predict. Clicktar's voice shook with disbelief as he announced the 8th phase and explained that subjects would now face the final trial where they must choose between personal survival and the survival of their teammates. This ultimate test had broken every previous species by forcing them to abandon their moral foundations and reveal the selfish brutality that the Council believed lay beneath the surface of all sentient beings. No participant had ever maintained their ethical principles when faced with the choice between their own life and the lives of others. The final chamber presented each human with a scenario where they could save themselves only by allowing their teammates to die in horrible ways that the projections made sickeningly realistic. The aliens had designed this test based on their understanding that survival instinct would ultimately overcome any social bonds or moral principles when beings faced their own extinction. Previous species had either chosen self-preservation and lived with the guilt that destroyed their civilizations, or chosen sacrifice and died uselessly without helping anyone. The alien observers waited for humanity's true nature to be revealed as the supposedly noble ideals gave way to the brutal reality of evolutionary survival programming. They expected to see the humans abandon each other or dissolve into conflict as individual preservation instincts overwhelmed their cooperative behavior. Instead, they witnessed something that had never happened in the history of the Crucible of Kethmora. Every single human chose to sacrifice themselves for their teammates without hesitation or internal conflict. Morrison stepped forward to take a death that would save Rodriguez, who simultaneously moved to take a death that would save Carter, who was already positioning himself to take a death that would save Dr. Park. The entire team demonstrated their willingness to die for each other, with such immediate certainty that the testing equipment could not even register the moral conflict it was designed to measure. But the humans did not stop with simple self-sacrifice because they had no intention of actually dying in a test chamber when their planet needed them to succeed. Carter immediately began rewiring the chamber's control systems, while Rodriguez created tactical solutions that bypassed the either-or constraints built into the scenario. Dr. Park found medical workarounds that kept everyone alive against impossible odds, while Chen improvised tools from available materials that should not have worked but somehow did exactly what was needed. The aliens had designed a test with only two possible outcomes, but the humans simply refused to accept those limitations and created a third option that saved everyone through applied ingenuity and stubborn determination to find solutions where none were supposed to exist. They treated the ultimate moral challenge of galactic civilization like an engineering problem that could be solved through teamwork and creative thinking. Click. Tar protested that the test was not supposed to work that way, and that participants had to choose between the predetermined options rather than creating their own alternatives. Morrison looked up at the observation deck with that same confident smile that had gotten him through impossible situations throughout his career and explained that finding alternatives to unacceptable choices was exactly how humans worked when faced with problems that seemed impossible to solve. Thompson pointed out that humans had been facing extinction-level events for their entire evolutionary history and had learned that survival often required refusing to accept the options that other species considered inevitable. The team had not broken the rules of the test because humans did not recognize the concept of impossible situations that could not be overcome through determination and creative problem-solving. Wilson explained to the confused aliens that human psychology was based on the principle that there was always another way to approach any problem and that giving up was simply not an option that their species considered viable. The moral choice between self and others was a false dilemma because humans had learned to find solutions that protected everyone rather than accepting that someone had to be sacrificed for the greater good. The observation deck fell, silent as the implications of what they had witnessed slowly penetrated the minds of species that had never encountered beings who simply refused to acknowledge the existence of impossible problems. The humans had not just survived the ultimate test of galactic civilization, they had made it look like routine problem-solving that any competent team could handle with basic training and common sense. 6 hours after entering what was supposed to be a months-long ordeal designed to break the strongest minds in the galaxy, the 12 humans emerged from the Crucible of Kethmora, looking tired and dirty, but otherwise unharmed by their experience. Jake Morrison stretched his back and rolled his shoulders to work out the kinks from spending the morning crawling through alien obstacle courses, while his team gathered around him with the casual efficiency of people who had just completed another routine training exercise. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez checked her equipment and noted that they had lost some minor gear during the trial, but nothing that could not be easily replaced from standard supplies. Engineer Ben Carter was already sketching improvements to the alien technology in his notebook and pointing out design flaws that had made the challenges unnecessarily complicated and potentially dangerous for species that were not prepared for the kind of problem-solving that humans considered basic survival skills. Dr. Lisa Park reviewed her medical scans of the team and reported that everyone was in excellent health with no signs of the psychological trauma or physical damage that had characterized every previous attempt at the trial. Mountain climber Alex Chen was discussing the climbing sections with deep-sea researcher Nicole Foster and comparing the alien obstacles to various dangerous environments they had encountered during their careers back on Earth. Morrison looked up at the observation deck where hundreds of alien dignitaries sat in stunned silence and announced that the warm-up exercise had been decent, but he was ready to face the actual test whenever the Galactic Council was prepared to begin the real challenge. His words echoed through the chamber and seemed to break the spell that had held the alien observers in shocked immobility, since the humans had started treating impossible challenges like minor inconveniences. High Arbiter Velnara found her voice after several minutes of silence and managed to whisper that what the humans had just completed was the actual test rather than a preliminary exercise. The Crucible of Cathamora represented the ultimate challenge that galactic civilization could devise, and no species in recorded history had ever survived the complete protocol without suffering permanent damage or death. Rodriguez looked confused and asked Morrison if he was sure they had completed the real test, because the whole experience had been easier than basic military training courses that human soldiers completed every few months just to maintain their qualifications for active duty. She pointed out that the environmental challenges had been significant, but well within normal operational parameters for humans, and that the psychological components had been fairly standard stress scenarios that any competent soldier learned to handle during their first year of service. Carter was examining the alien technology with obvious professional interest and offering suggestions for how the efficiency could be improved by about 30% through better power distribution and system integration. He asked Clicktar if he wanted to see detailed plans for upgrading the testing facility to provide more realistic challenges that might actually require participants to work hard instead of just going through the motions of solving simple problems. Elder Morden found his voice and asked in a barely audible whisper whether the humans were claiming that the trial, which had destroyed entire civilizations, was merely routine for their species. The question hung in the air like a challenge that no one wanted to acknowledge because the implications were too vast and disturbing for minds that had spent thousands of years believing they understood the limits of biological possibility. Morrison considered the question thoughtfully and explained that he would not call the experience routine because that would imply they faced similar challenges on a regular basis. He estimated that the trial rated about 4 out of 10 on the human difficulty scale, or maybe 6 if they factored in the time pressure and the uncertainty about what they would encounter during the test. Most of the individual challenges had been easier than things humans dealt with during normal work activities on their dangerous homeworld. Chen nodded helpfully and suggested that if the aliens wanted to see a real challenge, they should try free climbing El Capitan during a lightning storm or deep-sea welding on oil rigs in the North Sea during hurricane season, or just spending a winter in Minnesota without modern heating systems. He explained that Earth had spent millions of years trying to kill humanity, with everything from ice ages to volcanic eruptions to plague bacteria to predators that could bite through steel armor. Walker grinned and pointed out that humans were too stubborn to quit when facing impossible odds because giving up was simply not part of their psychological makeup. Foster added that what the aliens did not understand was that Earth had been testing human survival skills for their entire evolutionary history and had been much more creative and persistent than anything galactic civilization could devise in a few thousand years of technological development. Dr. Wilson explained that human psychology was based on the assumption that every problem had a solution and that failure was only temporary setback rather than permanent defeat. The team had approached each phase of the trial as an engineering challenge that required creative thinking and teamwork, rather than a test of endurance that was designed to break their will to survive. Kliktar demanded to know how the humans had maintained such effective communication and coordination throughout the trial, when previous species had been reduced to individual survival mode within the first hour. Thompson explained that humans had learned to work together during crisis situations because cooperation increased everyone's chances of survival, and that abandoning teammates was considered the worst possible failure, rather than a reasonable response to overwhelming pressure. Velnara struggled to maintain her composure, as she realized that the implications of human success extended far beyond simple membership in the Galactic Confederation. If these beings could treat the ultimate test of survival as a routine training exercise, then what did that say about the challenges that galactic civilization might face in the future? The ancient species had always assumed that they represented the pinnacle of evolution, and that younger races needed thousands of years to develop comparable capabilities. Morrison sensed the confusion and concern among the alien observers and offered to help improve their emergency response protocols and safety standards and engineering specifications. He pointed out diplomatically that if the best survival challenge they could design was this easy for humans, then they might need assistance preparing for real emergencies that could threaten entire star systems or galactic regions. The humans began enthusiastically discussing improvements to galactic civilization's safety standards, while the alien representatives sat in shocked silence and tried to process what they had just witnessed. Carter was already drawing up plans for better testing facilities, while Rodriguez outlined training programs that could help other species develop basic survival skills that might save their lives during actual emergencies. Dr. Park suggested that human medical knowledge might help other species cope with environmental stresses that currently caused permanent damage or death, while Foster offered to share deep environment survival techniques that could expand the operational range of galactic exploration and colonization efforts. The team was treating their new status as full members of the Confederation as an opportunity to help improve everyone's capabilities, rather than simply gaining access to alien technology and resources. As the humans continued their enthusiastic planning session, the alien observers slowly realized that they had not just gained new members in their galactic community. They had gained teachers who could help them prepare for challenges that their ancient civilizations had never imagined facing. The test designed to break humanity had become their warm-up exercise, and the galaxy would never be the same because these impossible beings refused to acknowledge that anything was truly impossible when approached with enough determination and creative thinking. The Crucible of Kethmora would need to be completely redesigned if it was ever going to challenge humans, and the Galactic Council would need to reconsider everything they thought they knew about survival and endurance and the limits of biological capability. For the first time in millions of years, the ancient species had encountered beings who were stronger than they were, and the implications of that discovery would reshape galactic civilization in ways that no one could predict.